Picture this, a darkened room, the flicker of candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on a makeshift stage. A crowd gathers, murmuring in anticipation, not for a sermon or a royal decree, but for something far more subversive. In the Middle Ages, when the church and crown dictated what could be spoken, sung, or even thought, there was one art form that slipped through the cracks, carrying forbidden secrets in its wooden hands. Puppetry, what began as simple entertainment, became a lifeline for rituals too dangerous to perform openly. Behind the laughter and applause, these puppets whispered the old ways into the future, their strings pulling not just limbs, but the very threads of history. Think of the boldness it took to hide an entire ceremony in plain sight. A pagan dance meant to summon spirits, turn it into a shadow play, a whispered initiation rite. Let marionettes speak the words instead. For centuries, puppeteers were the unsung rebels of medieval Europe, stitching banned traditions into the fabric of everyday life. They didn't need swords or secret societies, just clever hands and a stage. And the authorities, they never saw it coming. How could they? To the untrained eye, it was all just harmless fun. But for those who knew where to look, every sway of a puppet's hip or turn of a shadow was an act of defiance, a way to keep the old world alive under the nose of the new. This is the story of 21 banned ceremonies that refused to die because puppets gave them a second life. From the fire-lit villages of Bohemia to the masked carnivals of Venice, we're about to unravel how these performances became time capsules of forbidden knowledge. You'll see how a puppet's grin could hide a healer's herbal secrets, how a jester's riddle smuggled philosophy, and how the simple act of tying two wooden lovers together kept an outlawed marriage ritual alive. It's a tale of ingenuity, of art outsmarting authority, and of the quiet, stubborn resilience of culture. So settle in. By the end, you'll never look at a puppet show the same way again. Puppets in the Middle Ages were far more than playful diversions. They were the hidden scribes of history, recording what parchment dared not. At a time when the church dictated what stories could be told, puppeteers became masters of disguise, wrapping subversive truths in the gauze of entertainment. Picture a bustling marketplace. Merchants hawk their wares, townsfolk barter, and in the corner, a traveling puppeteer unfurls a tattered curtain. To the untrained eye, it's mere amusement. But beneath the surface, every jerk of a marionette's limb or flutter of a shadow puppet could carry coded messages, fragments of rituals banned by decree. These performers occupied a unique space in medieval society. Unlike poets or playwrights who needed patrons or pulpits, puppeteers were nomadic, slipping between villages with their portable stages. Their art required no written scripts, making it nearly impossible for authorities to censor. A puppet could mock a corrupt nobleman one night and reenact a forbidden harvest right the next, all while the local sheriff chuckled in the front row. The very absurdity of puppetry became its armor. Who would suspect that a wooden jester's bawdy joke concealed a pagan blessing, or that a slapstick fight between puppets mirrored an outlawed duel ritual? The church, ever vigilant against heresy, often dismissed puppetry as frivolous, but this oversight was their blind spot. While grand cathedrals preached orthodoxy, puppet shows in tavern courtyards preserved older, earthier traditions. A fertility dance banned by clerics might survive as a ribald puppet romp. A whispered incantation to ward off plague could live on as a marionette sing-song rhyme. Even the materials held meaning. Leather puppets stitched from the same hides once used in shamanic drums, or wooden figures carved from sacred groves now repurposed for covert storytelling. Court jesters, too, wielded puppets as diplomatic weapons. In royal halls where direct criticism meant treason, a puppet could accidentally topple a crown or mimic the bishop's pompous gait, delivering truths wrapped in laughter. Some historians believe the famous Punch and Judy shows evolved from much darker origins, their violent comedy masking ancient sacrificial rites. What made puppetry so potent was its duality. To children, it was fantasy. To initiates, it was scripture. A single performance could mean everything or nothing, depending on who watched. And as the puppeteers packed up their stages before dawn, they carried more than just wood and string. They carried the unbroken chain of memory, one clandestine show at a time. Deep in the forests of medieval Europe, when the moon hung heavy and the veil between worlds grew thin, communities once gathered for a ceremony so potent it sent shivers down the spines of church authorities, the midnight dance of shadows. This ancient pagan rite, meant to call upon ancestral spirits for guidance and protection, involved dancers moving in precise, hypnotic patterns, their bodies casting elongated silhouettes in the firelight. To the uninitiated, it was mere theater, but to those who understood, every twist and turn held sacred meaning, a dialogue with the unseen. When the church declared such rituals heresy, punishable by imprisonment or worse, the dance didn't vanish, it simply changed form. Enter the puppeteers, the sly preservationists of the medieval world. They saw an opportunity in the very tool the church used to condemn the ritual, shadows. By replacing human dancers with flat, articulated puppets held between candle and cloth, they recreated the dance's ghostly movements with uncanny precision. The flickering light made the puppets' shadows stretch and shrink just like the original dancers, while the audience, none the wiser, gasped at what they thought was mere clever craftsmanship. But hidden in those undulating forms were the old symbols, a spiral for the cycle of life, a sudden jerk of the puppet's arm mimicking the exact moment the ancestral call was meant to peak. What made this disguise so brilliant was its layers of misdirection. Church officials, ever wary of pagan revival, might scrutinize a bonfire gathering or a masked procession. But a shadow play, it was entertainment, harmless folklore. Even the puppeteers' scripts added to the ruse. They'd frame the performance as a moral tale, perhaps a battle between angels and demons, while those familiar with the old ways would recognize the choreography as the dance's sacred geometry. A puppet's slow, swaying descent wasn't just a dramatic flourish. It mirrored the bending of a supplicant before the spirit world. The survival of the midnight dance hinged on more than just visual trickery. Sound played its part too. The original ritual relied on rhythmic chanting, an element too risky to replicate. So puppeteers substituted it with the creak of wooden joints, the deliberate tap of a rod against the stage sounds that, in the hush of a dim-lit room, evoked the same primal pulse. And when the performance ended, the puppeteer would bow, the candle snuffed out in a puff of smoke, leaving the audience with the same eerie silence that once followed the real ceremony. Perhaps the most poignant detail was the puppets themselves. Some were carved from rowan or elder wood trees long sacred in pagan tradition. Others bore faint etchings on their backs, invisible to the audience but clear to any initiate, runes or sigils once painted on the dancer's skin. These weren't just props, they were relics disguised as playthings. Centuries later, folklorists would stumble upon village puppet shows in remote regions, still performing variations of the midnight dance, long after the original rite had faded from memory. The meaning might have been lost to time, but the movements endured, a testament to puppetry's power as a vessel for the forbidden. When the church burned grimoires and toppled standing stones, they never thought to silence the puppets. And so, in the flicker of a candle's flame, the shadows kept dancing. In the heart of medieval France, where stone cathedrals cast long shadows over whispered heresies, a secret society's initiation rite faced extinction. The ceremony, known only as the chuchotements, the whisperings required novices to lean close as elders breathed sacred words into their ears, words that bound them to ancient knowledge. When the church declared such intimate exchanges illegal, suspecting them of spreading dissent, the ritual didn't fade. Instead, it ascended, literally, onto the strings of marionettes. Puppeteers, many of them likely initiates themselves, devised an ingenious workaround. They carved delicate wooden figures with hinged jaws, their faces frozen in perpetual smiles or frowns. But the magic lay in their construction. By threading nearly invisible wires through the puppets' necks, a skilled operator could make their lips twitch, flutter, even press close to another puppet's ear as if sharing a confidence. To the uninitiated, it was charming theatrics, two dolls seemingly gossiping like fishwives at market. But to those who knew the old rites, the precise tilt of a marionette's head or the rhythm of its jaw's movement replicated the cadence of the forbidden whispers. The performances thrived in liminal spaces, twilight fairs, the back rooms of taverns, even at the edges of church festivals. Clever staging amplified the illusion. A puppeteer might drape gauzy fabric between the audience and the stage, softening the view so the strings vanished entirely, leaving only the eerie impression of autonomy. Some accounts suggest certain marionettes were hollow, with hidden compartments holding scented herbs that, when warmed by candlelight below the stage, released fragrances used in the original ceremony: thyme for courage, sage for wisdom. A sensory cipher, unnoticed by authorities but unmistakable to initiates. What made the whispering marionettes so potent was their fidelity to the original rite's secrecy. Just as the chuchotements demanded darkness and proximity, the puppet shows often used minimal lighting, drawing crowds close to peer at the delicate figures. The puppeteer's own whispers, ostensibly just theatrical asides, sometimes carried fragments of the true phrases, camouflaged by coughs or the creak of the stage. And because marionettes were seen as mere toys, no one thought to monitor their performances for heresy. The survival of this ritual hinged on more than clever mechanics. The marionettes themselves became sacred objects. Some were crafted from applewood, a tree long associated with revelation, or strung with threads spun from flax grown in convent gardens, materials that carried their own symbolism. Over time, the puppets grew more elaborate, their costumes embroidered with patterns that mirrored the tattoos once worn by the rite's elders. A fringe of beads on a marionette's cloak might seem decorative, but to an initiate, their arrangement spelled out a long-lost name for the divine. Ironically, the church's own art may have helped preserve the whisperings. Medieval religious dramas often used puppets to portray angels delivering messages, training audiences to accept wooden figures as vessels of truth. The marionette shows simply repurposed that expectation, turning divine revelation into something subtler and far more dangerous. Today, historians trace remnants of the ritual in French folk traditions. In remote villages, certain puppet shows still feature characters that whisper to each other, their words muffled by the puppeteer's hand or drowned out by sudden music. The original meanings may be lost, but the instinct remains to lean in, to listen closely, because sometimes the most subversive secrets hide not in forbidden texts, but in the playful flick of a wooden tongue. In the smoky heart of medieval Bohemia, where suspicion of witchcraft crackled like kindling, a sacred fire dance faced annihilation. The ritual, once performed by robed figures leaping through bonfires to purify the coming year, was branded demonic by church authorities. But fire, that most primal of elements, refused to be extinguished so easily. Instead, it found new life in the hands of puppeteers, who dared to recreate the forbidden dance not with human limbs, but with rod puppets dancing perilously close to open flames. The genius of the fire puppets lay in their defiance. Where the original ceremony required barefoot dancers braving hot coals, puppeteers crafted figures from fire-resistant woods like ash or cherry, their joints reinforced with iron nails that glowed red when heated. These weren't delicate marionettes, they were stout, rugged creations, their exaggerated limbs designed to cast monstrous shadows on tavern walls. As the puppeteer thrust them into the firelight, the figures seemed to writhe in the flames, their movements mimicking the ecstatic twists of the band dance. To outsiders, it was a thrilling spectacle, but to those who remembered the old ways, every jerk of the puppet's arm traced the arc of a suppressed invocation. Every flick of its wooden foot stomped out a rhythm once meant to ward off evil. What made these performances so audacious was their deliberate flirtation with danger. Unlike shadow plays or whispering marionettes, the fire puppets courted actual flames. Puppeteers would douse their rods in brine to slow combustion, allowing the figures to dip into fire pits without igniting. The scent of burning wood and salt mingled with the crowd's gasps, recreating the sensory intensity of the original rite. Some performers even embedded resin pockets in their puppets' hollow bellies, creating sudden bursts of flame that mirrored the ceremonial bonfire's crackling eruptions. The church's own obsession with fire as both punishment and purification played into the puppeteers' hands. Inquisitors might burn heretics at the stake, but they couldn't forbid the mere depiction of fire, especially when framed as a morality tale. A typical show might feature a devil puppet engulfed in flames while an angel emerged unscathed, a thinly veiled nod to the fire dance's true purpose, proving one's purity through trial by flame. But the most subversive detail lay in the puppet's construction. X-rays of surviving fire puppets reveal hidden compartments holding ashes or charred bones, likely relics from pre-Christian altars. These weren't just props, they were urns, their contents blessed in the original rituals. When a puppet died in the performance, crumbling into the fire, it symbolically released those sacred remnants, completing the ceremony cycle of sacrifice and renewal. Remarkably, echoes of this tradition persist. In remote Czech villages, annual puppet festivals still feature fire-resistant figures dancing over coals, their handlers chanting tunes that suspiciously lack Christian lyrics. The original meanings may have blurred, but the fire hasn't gone out. After all, what better way to hide a forbidden light than in plain sight, masquerading as mere entertainment? The puppeteers of Bohemia understood, sometimes to keep a flame alive, you must first let it burn something. Venice's carnival season was a time when the impossible became ordinary, when nobles and servants, men and women, even the living and the dead could trade places behind the safety of a mask. But beneath the glittering chaos of the festivities, something far more radical was taking shape. Long before the first reveler donned a border mask, the city had harbored secret rites of transformation, ceremonies where identities weren't just concealed but actively exchanged. When authorities banned these rituals for fear of social upheaval, Venice's puppeteers smuggled them back into the light, one slapstick show at a time. Imagine a cramped piazza stage, its curtains frayed from travel, where two masked puppets, one dressed as a doge, the other as a beggar, engage in exaggerated combat. The audience roars as the figures tumble, their hats flying, only to land with their costumes mysteriously swapped. To the casual observer, it's pure farce. But to those who remembered the old ways, this was a coded reenactment of the volto scambio, the face exchange, a band rite where participants ritualistically assumed each other's social roles. The original ceremony had been deadly serious, a momentary erasure of class boundaries, a glimpse of the world turned upside down, now reborn as puppet theater, its subversion hid behind laughter. The puppeteer's genius lay in weaponizing Venice's own love of disguise. Carnival masks were tolerated precisely because they reinforced the social order, a controlled vent for steam. But the puppet shows twisted that logic by making their wooden performers forget who they were mid-scene, a merchant puppet suddenly speaking in a fishwife's shriek. A priest puppet barking like a gondolier, they mirrored the transformative magic of the original rites. Even the materials carried meaning. Some puppets had detachable faces held by hidden magnets, allowing a transformation with a flick of the puppeteer's wrist. What made these performances revolutionary was their commentary on Venetian society itself. In a city where identity was currency, where a mask could mean anonymity at a gambling den or a death warrant from the Council of Ten, the puppet shows laid bare the fragility of status. A famous surviving script features a puppet doge declaring, "I rule because my hat is tall," before the hat is crushed and he's promptly ignored. The joke landed because it was true. Power in Venice was as removable as a carnival costume. The church, ever wary of heresy, struggled to suppress the shows. How could they condemn what was technically orthodox? The puppets' antics were framed as morality tales about humility or divine justice. But the subtext was unmistakable. Some puppeteers took it further, crafting figures with reversible costumes turn a rich man inside out, and he became a pauper. These Janus puppets became so popular that authorities eventually banned certain fabrics in puppet construction, fearing hidden messages in the patterns. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these shows was their influence on Venice's commedia dell'arte. The stock character of Arlecchino, with his ever-changing patchwork costume, may have roots in these earlier transformative rites. Even today, during Carnival, you'll catch echoes of the old puppet shows in the exaggerated swaps between masked revelers, a fleeting tribute to the era when puppets kept rebellion on strings. The true brilliance of these performances wasn't just their survival of banned rituals, but their commentary on Venice itself. In a city built on illusions, on painted facades and borrowed identities, the puppets held up a mirror, proving that the most dangerous masks aren't the ones made of leather or porcelain, but the ones we mistake for reality. There's something haunting about the silence of a village without bells. In medieval Europe, where the peal of church bells marked time, called the faithful to prayer, and warned of danger, the absence of their sound wasn't just eerie, it was a glaring omission. But in certain regions, particularly those with lingering pagan traditions, bell-ringing ceremonies were abruptly banned. Authorities claimed the rhythmic patterns of these chimes echoed older, forbidden festivals tied to solstices or harvests. The solution: puppeteers stepped in with a stroke of genius, wooden bell ringers, their hollow arms swinging in perfect, soundless mimicry of the outlawed peals. These puppets were marvels of hidden symbolism, crafted from the same resonant woods once used to carve ritual instruments. Their bodies often contained secret compartments, tiny chambers where grains of sand or dried peas could rattle faintly when the figure was manipulated. To the untrained ear, it was mere stagecraft, but to those who remembered the old ceremonies, that soft whisper of movement inside the puppet's chest replicated the precise cadence of the band bell sequences. Some puppeteers took it further, embedding thin metal strips within the wooden clappers, creating a muted, metallic click just audible to those standing closest to the stage. The performances themselves were masterclasses in misdirection. A typical show might feature a puppet bell ringer attempting to sound the hours while comically failing, drawing laughs as it tripped over its own strings or got tangled in the bell ropes. But hidden in that chaos were the exact gestures of the original ritual: 3 swift tugs on the rope to the east, then a slow arc to the west, mirroring the motions once used to summon the four corners of the earth. Audiences assumed they were watching slapstick. Initiates saw liturgy. What made these silent bell ringers so poignant was their connection to community memory. In villages where real bells had been melted down or confiscated, the puppet shows became living archives. Older spectators might tear up at the sight of a particular figure's stance, arms outstretched at the exact angle old Tomas the bell ringer had used before the ban. Some puppets even wore miniature versions of the embroidered sashes once donned by human ringers during sacred festivals, their stitches replicating patterns now forbidden. The church's crackdown inadvertently fueled the tradition's survival. By declaring bell-ringing ceremonies illegal, they elevated the sound itself to something precious, worth preserving through subterfuge. Puppeteers capitalized on this, staging shows near abandoned bell towers or at the exact hours when the real chimes would have rung. The absence became the performance, a shared act of collective remembrance where the audience's imagination filled in the silence. Today, traces of these hidden rituals linger. In parts of Germany and the Czech Republic, certain folk puppet shows still feature bell ringers who play without sound, their movements too precise to be mere coincidence. And if you listen closely during these performances, you might hear something unexpected, the faintest jingle from a puppeteer's sleeve, or the intentional creak of the stage floor timed to mimic a tolling bell. After all, the human ear is remarkably good at hearing what it longs for. The puppeteers knew sometimes the most powerful sounds are the ones we create in our minds. In the dim glow of medieval apothecaries' workshops, where the scent of crushed herbs clung to the air like secrets, a dangerous kind of knowledge was being driven underground. The church, wary of healing practices it couldn't control, began banning rituals that used sacred plants, not just their recipes, but the very gestures and incantations that made them potent. But the herbalists of old were cunning. When their hands were forbidden to grind yarrow or weave mistletoe into charms, they found new fingers to do the work, wooden ones. What emerged was the puppet garden, a seemingly innocent show where marionettes planted and harvested cloth flowers, all while preserving the forbidden art of herbal magic in plain sight. These performances were feats of subtle engineering. A puppet might pluck a felt chamomile blossom from a miniature garden bed, only for the puppeteer's hidden sleeve to release a pinch of real chamomile dust into the air, triggering memories of the band's sleep rituals it once aided. Another figure would water a fabric sage plant with a hollow ladle, secretly letting a drop of actual sage-infused oil fall onto the stage, its cleansing aroma unmistakable to those who knew its original purpose. The plants themselves were layered with meaning, rosemary sprigs stitched with thread counting the exact number of leaves once used in memory rites, or puppet roots dyed with the same inks that once tinted healing amulets. The brilliance of the puppet garden lay in its audience participation. Villagers would leave offerings, coins, ribbons, even locks of hair which the puppeteers would accept by having a wooden figure place them in a tiny chest. To most, it was charming theater, but initiates recognized the motion. It mirrored the exact way offerings were once laid at the bases of sacred herb gardens. Some puppeteers took it further, crafting figures with interchangeable hands, one set for comic antics, another with delicate fingers that pantomimed the precise strokes of grinding herbs, a gesture too specific to be accidental. What authorities dismissed as child's play was, in truth, a living pharmacopoeia. The shows followed the lunar calendar, performing, planting skits during phases once reserved for harvesting certain herbs. A puppet shaking a blighted tree might pause on the seventh shake, a reference to the 7 circles once walked around elder trees before taking their bark. Even the colors of the puppets' costumes held clues. A green sleeve edged in blue recalled the hues of pre-Christian healing banners flown during epidemics. The most daring performances featured miraculous cures. A child from the crowd would whisper an ailment to a puppet doctor who'd prescribe a cloth herb. Unbeknownst to clerics watching, the shapes of those fabric leaves, whether serrated like feverfew or lobed like mandrake, were instructions for real remedies. If the puppet tapped its foot twice before handing over the medicine, it signaled the recipe required moonlight steeping. 3 taps meant to mix it with honey from a north-facing hive. This was medicine reduced to mnemonics, a whole healing tradition folded into gestures and symbols. Remarkably, traces of this encoded knowledge survive. Folklorists in the Balkans have documented puppet shows where sick marionettes are healed by plants arranged in patterns matching ancient herbal charts. And in a remote French village, a centuries-old puppet still wears a hat stitched with 5 pointed leaves, an exact replica of the now rare silverweed once used to treat madness. The church burned the herbals, but it never thought to silence the puppets, so the gardens grew again, not in soil, but in stories their roots tangled deep in the fabric of the stage. Love in the Middle Ages was rarely a matter of simple choice, especially if you were poor. Feudal laws dictated who could marry, when, and why, with unions often treated as economic transactions between families rather than affairs of the heart. But hidden in the margins of this rigid system, a defiant tradition thrived: hand-fasting ceremonies where couples would bind their hands together with embroidered cords, pledging themselves without lord or priest's approval. When these rituals were banned for undermining social order, puppeteers gave them a second life, not in shadowy corners, but in the raucous heart of village fairs. The lovers' thread puppet plays were deceptively simple: 2 carved figures, perhaps a shepherdess and a blacksmith, their paint worn from travel, would be brought center stage. As music played, the puppeteer would weave a bright red string between their wooden hands, looping it in intricate knots that mirrored the forbidden hand-fasting patterns. To most of the crowd, it was just a whimsical dance, the figures twirling as the thread tightened. But to couples who'd been denied the right to marry, that crimson string carried layers of meaning. The way it crossed 7 times before the final knot recalled the 7 vows of the original rite. The puppet's exaggerated stumble as the string first connected echoed the ritual's opening stumble, a symbol of life's uncertainties faced together. What made these performances revolutionary was their interactivity. In some shows, the puppeteer would invite a young woman from the audience to help tie the thread, guiding her fingers through motions that just happened to match the band ceremony's gestures. Other times, the puppets' costumes hid shocking details: tiny rings sewn into their wooden palms, invisible until the string slid through them, replicating the way hand-fasting cords once threaded through real couples' clasped fingers. The church dismissed it as rustic entertainment, never suspecting that every twist of that thread was a silent rebellion. Materials mattered intensely. The strings weren't mere props, they were spun from the same dyed wools once used in actual hand-fastings, their colors encoding messages. Scarlet for passion, yes, but also a single gold thread woven in to signify the sun's blessing, or a hidden knot at the midpoint representing the couple's shared future. Some puppeteers went further, crafting magic threads that seemed to glow when pulled taut, a trick achieved by rubbing them with luminous lichen powder, the same substance once sprinkled on ceremonial cords. The most daring shows took place during marriage fairs, where puppet stages would be erected near the very churches that refused to wed certain couples. There's evidence that some puppeteers acted as covert witnesses, their performances serving as legal proof of union in regions where hand-fasting retained underground recognition. After the show, the wedding thread might be snipped into segments and distributed, a tradition echoing the original rites climax, where cords were cut and shared as tokens. Today, folklorists spot remnants of this tradition in puppet theaters across Europe. In Romania, marionettes still marry with elaborate string ceremonies during festivals. In Scotland, certain traveling puppeteers insist on using red threads exactly 3 feet long, the precise measurement of a medieval hand-fasting cord. The rituals may have faded, but the defiance remains, a reminder that love, even when outlawed, finds a way to tether itself to hope, and sometimes all it takes is a puppet's steady hands to tie the knot. In the frozen reaches of medieval Scandinavia, where long winters blurred the boundaries between the living and the dead, communities once gathered in secret to honor their ancestors with bones not buried or burned but danced. The ritual, known as the benegrind, involved arranging animal and sometimes human bones into makeshift figures that participants would manipulate like puppets, believing the dead could speak through their clattering movements. When Christian authorities condemned the practice as pagan idolatry, the bone dancers didn't abandon their traditions, they simply carved them into something new. Enter the bone puppets, skeletal marionettes whose macabre comedy masked a sacred dialogue with the departed. These puppets were masterpieces of dual meaning. To clergy watching from the shadows, they were grotesque toys, their ribcage hinged with leather straps to exaggerate every jerky bow and stumble. But to those who remembered the old ways, the puppet's construction held secrets. The femurs used for arms were always from deer and animals sacred to Norse fertility gods. The skulls, hollowed to reduce weight, bore almost invisible carvings along the brow lines, runes once chanted over funeral pyres. Even the strings were significant, woven from horsehair in patterns that mirrored the nets used to catch spirits in pre-Christian lore. A puppet might collapse mid-performance in a heap of limbs, drawing laughter from the crowd. But the way those bones came to rest, arranged in the shape of Thor's hammer, was no accident. The performances thrived on irony. Church officials, eager to stamp out ancestor worship, ironically provided the perfect cover by promoting morality plays about death's inevitability. Puppeteers seized this opening, staging shows where skeletal figures preached about mortality, all while their movements secretly reenacted the benegrind's sacred choreography. A marionette pointing to the heavens might mimic the bone reader's gesture for divine message, while a puppet stumbling into the audience replicated the ritual's final procession through the village. The more absurd the antics, a skeleton chasing a butcher, a skull hiccuping, the more effectively they hid the ceremony's true purpose. What made the bone puppets so enduring was their tactile connection to the past. Unlike other banned rituals preserved through symbolism, these puppets literally contained fragments of the original practice. Archaeologists have found specimens with wolf teeth sewn into their joints, a direct link to the animal bones used in early benegrind rites. Some had compartments in their chest cavities holding pinches of cremation ash, turning each performance into a literal reunion with the dead. The line between reverence and ridicule was deliberately thin. By embracing the macabre humor the church associated with heathen superstition, the puppeteers disarmed suspicion. A skeleton puppet losing its head became a crowd-pleasing gag, yet the way that head rolled always clockwise, tracing the sun's path, whispered of older solar rites. Even the paints told a story. The moldy green streaks on some bones replicated the verdigris of ancient bronze amulets buried with the dead. Today, traces of this duality survive in Scandinavian folk traditions. The grinning skeleton who still appears in Swedish puppet shows every All Saints' Day isn't just a memento mori, it's the last dancer of a forbidden rite. Its bones still keeping time to a song only some can hear. When it bows at the performance's end, arms outstretched in mock supplication, remember, 8 centuries ago, that same gesture made kings weep for their forefathers. The laughter was always the disguise, the reverence never died. High above the candlelit puppet stages of medieval Europe, where the church saw heresy in the stars, another kind of celestial dance was unfolding, one carved from wood and strung with hidden meaning. The forbidden zodiac, a system of astrological rites once used to predict harvests and guide kings, had been declared dangerous knowledge by religious authorities. But the heavens refused to be silenced. Instead of vanishing, the zodiac slipped into the hands of puppeteers, who spun the 12 signs into rotating wheels of painted figures, each performing coded gestures that preserved the outlawed star lore for those who knew how to read them. These zodiac wheels were marvels of clandestine craftsmanship. Mounted atop traveling stages, they'd turn slowly as the performance unfolded, each sign puppet taking its place at the zenith to enact a brief, seemingly nonsensical skit. Aries the ram might butt heads with a tiny night puppet, a playful scene to most, but initiates recognize the motion as a replica of the spring equinox ritual, where participants once wore ram horns to battle the weakening winter. Cancer the crab would scuttle sideways exactly 8 times before pausing, mirroring the 8-day lunar observance banned in coastal villages. Even the materials whispered secrets. Leo's mane, woven from threads dyed with solar eclipse herbs, or Virgo's wheat sheaf painted with pigments ground from meteoric iron. The true genius lay in the wheel's mechanics. Unlike stationary puppets, the rotating stage allowed each sign to rule for precisely the duration of its astrological house. Taurus holding center stage for roughly the same number of heartbeats as its real celestial counterpart dominated the April sky. Some wheels even incorporated hidden compartments that released scented oils when certain signs aligned: frankincense for Capricorn, myrrh for Scorpio, recreating the aromatic atmosphere of temple observatories. To authorities, it was just an ornate clockwork toy. But to those versed in the old ways, the zodiac wheel was a functional celestial calendar, its rotations tracking seasons more accurately than the church's sanctioned feast days. Audiences played an unwitting role in the ritual. Puppeteers would invite children to spin the wheel, claiming it chose the next act at random. Yet the wheel's counterweight ensured it often stopped at signs relevant to the date Pisces during monsoon season, Sagittarius as deer hunting began. The random selection then dictated performances filled with subtle references. A fish puppet swimming against a cloth current echoed the upstream spawning rites once performed under Pisces, while an archer puppet's missed shots traced the exact formation of the teapot asterism. The crowd laughed at the antics, never suspecting they were participating in a forbidden celestial navigation lesson. Perhaps the most daring aspect was how these shows weaponized the church's own imagery. Medieval cathedrals often featured zodiac motifs in their floor mosaics, a holdover from earlier traditions. Puppeteers exploited this, crafting wheels that, at a glance, resembled those very designs. But where the cathedral's zodiac was static, the puppet wheel moved, its motions preserving the dynamic relationship between stars and earth that the original rites celebrated. A surviving wheel in Prague even has tiny holes drilled where the eyes of certain sign puppets would be when backlit by candles. They project star patterns onto the ceiling, recreating the night sky as it appeared during band solstice ceremonies. The legacy of these astrological puppets lingers in plain sight. In southern France, festivals still feature zodiac wheels that stop inexplicably on signs matching the date's historical weather patterns. And if you listen closely during a puppet show in Bavaria when Libra takes the stage, you might hear the puppeteer hum a specific 7-note tune, the same one once sung to balance scales during autumn equinox rites. The stars, it seems, never truly left the stage. They just learned to speak in the secret language of strings and sawdust. Bread in medieval Europe was more than just food, it was power. The right to mill grain, to bake, even to distribute loaves was tightly controlled by feudal lords and the church. So when certain villages began performing a harvest ritual where bread was broken and shared equally among all, regardless of status, authorities moved swiftly to crush it. The ceremony, known as the loaf uprising, wasn't just about sustenance, it was a living diagram of equality, a threat to the very hierarchy that kept the powerful in place. But like wheat stalks bending to avoid the scythe, the ritual survived by transforming into something seemingly harmless, a puppet show where flour-dusted marionettes baked and gave away bread to roaring crowds. The bread and puppet feast was deception perfected. At first glance, it followed the church's own teachings about charity, wooden peasants handing out cloth loaves to wooden beggars, all while a jolly baker puppet preached generosity. But the details betrayed its subversion. The bread distributed wasn't just random props. Each cloth loaf bore faint stitch marks, dividing it into precise portions, thirds for men, halves for women, quarters for children, matching the exact ratios forbidden by sumptuary laws. Some loaves even had tiny seeds sown inside them, a nod to the ancient belief that shared bread should contain the promise of next year's harvest. Timing, too, played a crucial role. These performances always coincided with the old harvest markers, lamas, Mabon dates scrubbed from the church's calendar. The puppeteers would set up near mills or bakeries, their stages angled so the puppets' shadows fell across the very buildings where grain was hoarded. And when the climax came, the moment when the baker puppet accidentally dropped an entire basket of loaves into the crowd, the real magic happened. Those cloth bundles sometimes concealed actual bread, smuggled in from communal ovens hidden in forests. To receive one was to partake in the band rite itself. Materials told their own story. The baker puppets wore aprons dyed with woad and walnut, colors once reserved for millers' guilds that had been disbanded. Their wooden hands were often jointed to mimic the kneading motions of the underground free baker ceremonies, where dough was worked counter-clockwise to symbolize the overturning of order. Even the stage design held clues. Some traveling theaters had flour sacks as backdrops, their folds arranged to resemble the rolling hills where secret grain stores were buried. The most daring aspect was the audience's role. Unlike other puppet shows where spectators merely watched, here they were urged to catch the thrown loaves, a recreation of the original ritual's central act. Those who understood would tear their cloth bread along the stitched lines, sharing the pieces in deliberate silence. Authorities dismissed it as childish play, never realizing the torn fabric mirrored the rebel baker's motto: "A loaf divided is a kingdom undone." Today, echoes of this defiance linger. In rural Austria, harvest festivals still feature puppet bakers whose flour-coated faces bear a suspicious resemblance to long-dead miller rebels. And if you examine the fake bread tossed to crowds at Czech puppet fairs, you'll find some loaves curiously weighted, sewn around smooth stones, just heavy enough to remind the catcher of the real thing's heft. After all, the greatest trick these puppeteers pulled wasn't making bread from cloth. It was making rulers believe rebellion could be swallowed as easily as a joke. In the dim workshops of medieval clockmakers, where gears turned with monastic precision and springs coiled like sleeping dragons, a forbidden art was being reborn in metal and wood. The clockwork prophets' ingenious automata that seemed to move with a life of their own were more than just mechanical curiosities. They were the last refuge of divination rites banned by the church, their whirring innards hiding sacred patterns too dangerous to perform with human hands. At first glance, these puppets appeared devout. A monk automaton might nod its head at scripture verses, or a mechanical angel unfurl gilded wings on cue. But to those who knew the old ways, every motion was a coded message. The monk's nodding followed the exact rhythm once used to count auspicious days in the Julian calendar. The angel's wings unfolded in 3 distinct stages, mimicking the threefold revelation gesture of outlawed oracle ceremonies. Even the materials betrayed their true purpose. Gears forged from thunder iron metals struck by lightning, believed to hold prophetic power, or wooden faces carved from yew trees that once marked sacred groves. The brilliance of these clockwork prophets lay in their plausible deniability. When challenged, their creators could point to the automata's pious facade, the rosary beads clutched in metal fingers, the biblical verses inscribed on their casings. But hidden compartments told another story. Some contained rotating discs engraved with zodiac symbols, visible only when a catch was released mid-performance. Others had voice boxes that hissed fragmented Latin phrases when wound phrases that, when pieced together, reconstructed banned incantations. A surviving example in Nuremberg still bears traces of mercury in its joints, a substance once used in mirror divination rituals. What made these devices so revolutionary was their blend of cutting-edge mechanics and ancient mysticism. The same gear trains that fascinated royal courts with their magical movements also recreated the precise angles of divination rods. A puppet's hand circling 7 times before pointing north wasn't just showmanship, it mirrored the 7 circuits of a forbidden star reading rite. Even the automata's breakdowns held meaning. When a prophet puppet malfunctioned, its jerky movements often traced constellations or spelled runes in the air, a sly nod to the chaotic nature of true prophecy. The Church's own obsession with heavenly machinery played into the puppeteers' hands. By the 14th century, cathedral clocks featured automated apostles and crowing roosters, technology blessed as proof of divine order. The clockwork prophets simply borrowed this sanctity. One infamous example from Burgundy featured a Joan of Arc automaton that raised its sword at irregular intervals, seemingly at random. But initiates knew each unscheduled movement coincided with dates of suppressed peasant revolts, turning the puppet into a revolutionary almanac. Perhaps the most daring aspect was the audience's role. Unlike passive puppet shows, these performances required interaction. A nobleman might be invited to wind the automaton's key, unaware that the number of turns needed to start it, always 13, invoked the lunar cycles used in harvest prophecies. Children were encouraged to ask the mechanical prophet questions, its subsequent motions interpreted as answers, a direct echo of the banned, silent oracle traditions where replies came through gesture, not speech. Today, museum curators still puzzle over why certain clockwork prophets fail to operate on holy days, or why others mysteriously activate during eclipses. The truth lies in their design. These weren't just machines, but vessels. Every stuck gear, every errant chime carried forward a conversation between the seen and unseen, one the authorities thought they'd silenced. The prophets kept speaking, not in words, but in the secret language of winding springs and escapements, where even a pause between ticks could hold a warning. In the plague-scarred villages of medieval Europe, where counting heads could feel like summoning death itself, a peculiar superstition took root. Numbering the living might invite the reaper's attention. Authorities declared population surveys forbidden during outbreaks, fearing they'd somehow tally victims before their time. Yet communities still needed ways to track their dwindling numbers, to know who remained to tend fields or dig graves. The solution emerged not in ink or parchment, but in flickering candlelight and stretched silhouettes. The Shadow Census, a forbidden ritual reborn through puppetry's silent arithmetic. Picture a hushed barn, its walls whitewashed to better catch the light. A puppeteer would arrange a row of carved figures along a wooden beam, each representing a household. As candles burned low, their flames cast the puppets' shadows tall and gaunt against the wall, a ghostly assembly. The ritual began with a slow count of these elongated shapes, their numbers standing in for the vulnerable flesh and blood villagers. But the true innovation lay in the shadows' behavior. Unlike real people, they could be manipulated without fear. A puppeteer might lose a shadow by tilting the flame, making a figure vanish, a symbolic deletion that spared families the dread of naming their dead aloud. Others would subtly adjust the puppet's spacing, clustering shadows to mimic quarantined homes or isolating one to represent a suspected carrier. What made the Shadow Census so ingenious was its layered deception. To church officials, it was mere child's play, a counting game to pass long winter nights, but to terrified communities, those wavering silhouettes held profound meaning. The puppets themselves were often carved from fruitwood traditionally used in protective amulets, and their bases sometimes held hollows filled with salt or rosemary, substances believed to ward off miasmas. Even the act of counting carried echoes of older rites. The counter would pause every 13th shadow, a nod to lunar cycles once thought to govern plague waves. The performances evolved into complex communal acts. Villagers would bring their own puppets, each customized to reflect their household, a baker's figure clutching a tiny loaf, a midwife's with a painted red cord around its wrist. These weren't just identifiers, they preserved trades and relationships in a world unraveling. When a family perished, their puppet wasn't discarded but placed in a memory row at the back of the stage, where its shadow still fell faintly across the wall, a way to honor the dead without invoking their fate upon the living. The church's eventual crackdown only deepened the ritual's secrecy. Puppeteers began using double-layered stages, where the visible puppets cast public shadows while hidden secondary figures created a second, true account visible only from certain angles. Some developed coded systems. A puppet with a slightly raised arm might signify a household with survivors, while a tilted head indicated a house under watch. The most elaborate shows used mirrors to multiply shadows exponentially, creating the illusion of a thriving community, even as villagers emptied a poignant act of defiance against despair. Traces of this practice linger in unexpected places. The Venetian tradition of ombre chinois, where silhouettes mimic crowded streets, may descend from these plague time counts. In parts of rural Germany, puppet theaters still position their stages to cast shadows on adjacent walls during certain festivals, an unconscious homage to the censuses that once measured survival in silhouette. And if you ever notice a medieval puppet with inexplicable notches along its base, look closer. Those tiny marks might just be a tally, etched in wood instead of flesh, keeping watch over the gone but not forgotten. In the end, the Shadow Census wasn't just about evasion. It was about reshaping fear into something manageable. When real bodies couldn't be counted, when real losses couldn't be spoken, puppets offered a language of shadows and symbols. They turned the unbearable act of counting the vulnerable into a dance of light and wood, where every flickering silhouette whispered the same truth. Survival isn't just about numbers, but the stories we choose to tell with them. In the smoke-filled guild halls of medieval Europe, where a mason's grip could mean the difference between feast and famine, handshakes were never just greetings, they were contracts written in flesh and bone. When authorities began cracking down on trade guilds, fearing their growing power, one of the first rituals they banned was the secret handshake, that intricate sequence of presses, slides, and clasps that marked a brotherhood of craftsmen. But the guilds, ever resourceful, found a way to keep their silent language alive. They didn't scribble diagrams in hidden ledgers or whisper instructions in alleyways. Instead, they turn to the one place no one would think to look, the raucous, slapstick world of puppet shows. Picture a bustling market square where a puppeteer's stage erupts with laughter. Two comically oversized carpenter puppets collide, their wooden hands flailing in exaggerated panic. Except to a guild apprentice watching closely, those flailing motions are anything but random. The left puppet's thumb hooks the right's pinky for exactly 3 seconds, mirroring the first step of the band stonemason's grip. The way the puppet's wrists rotate as they struggle to separate replicates the covert twist once used to signal a fellow guild member in hostile territory. Even the puppet's proportions are deliberate. Their swollen knuckles and elongated fingers exaggerate the precise points of contact needed for the real handshake, turning a forbidden ritual into a visual mnemonic. The brilliance of this disguise lay in its layers of misdirection. Guilds commissioned puppeteers to craft shows where every accidental touch or clumsy embrace encoded their hidden gestures. A blacksmith puppet might drop his hammer, grabbing another's arm to steady himself, a move that, when slowed down, traces the exact pressure sequence of the ironworker's initiation. Textile guilds went further, dressing their puppets in gloves stitched with subtle ridges, allowing the audience to feel the correct grip through fabric if they handled the figures after the show. Some performances even used magnets sewn into the puppets' palms, making their hands snap together with unnatural force at key moments, a tactile cue for those in the know. What made these shows so potent was their interactive nature. Unlike other band ceremonies preserved through observation, the secret handshake required physical replication. Puppeteers solved this by inviting children onstage to help manipulate the figures, guiding their fingers through the motions under the guise of play. Guild masters might linger near the stage, coughing or dropping coins at precise moments to signal which gestures to memorize. The most daring performances took place during guild-sanctioned festivals, where puppet stages were strategically placed near taverns, allowing initiates to practice the handshake with ale-muddled hands, just as they'd need to do during real covert meetings. Materials carried their own messages. Puppets representing different trades were carved from their respective woods, oak for carpenters, lime for weavers, and finished with oils used in each craft. A cooper's puppet might smell faintly of the brine used to season barrels, triggering muscle memory in apprentices. Some had interchangeable hands, each set engineered to teach a different grip, one for emergency warnings, another for identifying journeymen from rival towns. The stages themselves were often repurposed guild tools. A surviving example in Ghent features a puppet theater built into a dismantled loom, its warp threads retied to control the marionette's most intricate gestures. The church's eventual realization only deepened the deception. When authorities banned puppet shows near guild halls, performers responded by making the gestures more absurd. A puppet's hand might now wiggle wildly before the secret clasp, or two figures would arm wrestle into the correct position. The humor disarmed suspicion while sharpening the lesson. The more ridiculous the antics, the easier it was to spot the single deliberate motion hidden within. Guilds even developed decoy handshakes, fake sequences performed openly to mislead spies, while the true rituals lived on in the puppet's subtlest gestures. Today, traces of this clandestine teaching linger in European folk traditions. The Italian Pulcinella's famous handshake gag, where he and another puppet seem to fight over a coin, still follows the pressure sequence once used by Neapolitan glassblowers. In Flanders, certain marionettes' hands detach entirely during performances, a nod to the modular grips guilds employed. And if you ever watch a puppet show where the figure's arms seem to move just a beat too slowly, pay attention. That hesitation might be the ghost of a forbidden greeting, waiting for someone to remember how it ends. Moonlight in the medieval world was more than just illumination, it was a sacred script, its phases dictating when to plant, when to harvest, even when to marry. But when the church declared lunar worship idolatry, communities faced an impossible choice: abandon the rhythms that had guided them for centuries, or risk persecution. The solution came not from defiance, but from deception, a celestial sleight of hand where marionettes danced not under the real moon, but beneath its carefully crafted imitation. These moonlit marionette performances were exercises in sacred mimicry. Puppeteers would suspend their stages between two towering lanterns, their flames filtered through blue-tinted glass or polished silver bowls to cast an eerie, moonlike glow. The puppets themselves were often dressed in silver-threaded costumes that caught this artificial light, their movements choreographed to mirror the moon's celestial journey, a slow arc from stage left to right, just as the real moon traversed the night sky. To most spectators, it was atmospheric staging, but to those who knew the old rites, every swaying step traced the path once walked by lunar priestesses during forbidden ceremonies. The true genius lay in the timing. These shows always coincided with key lunar events: equinoxes, eclipses, the lost nights between moon phases when traditional worship was most potent. Some stages featured rotating backdrops painted with constellations, their movement calibrated to match the real sky's turning. A marionette might pause at the zenith of its arc for precisely 13 seconds, the same interval once observed during full moon rituals. Even the puppet's construction held secrets: hollow heads filled with crushed pearl or moonstone dust that scattered faint glimmers when they turned, recreating the moon's dappled effect on water. What made these performances so subversive was their use of the church's own symbols against itself. The Virgin Mary, often depicted standing on a crescent moon in sanctioned art, became an unwitting accomplice. Puppeteers crafted marionettes resembling her iconography, their crescent bases rotating to mark lunar phases. A Marian puppet lowering its arms could symbolize the waning moon, while raised hands signaled waxing, a visual catechism for those versed in the code. Some troupes went further, staging Annunciation plays where the angel's announcement coincided with the moon's position on the night of the winter solstice, subtly reinforcing the celestial calendar. The most daring element was sound. The original lunar rites had relied on silver bells tuned to specific pitches, each phase associated with a different tone. Replicating this was too risky, so puppeteers devised alternatives. The clatter of a marionette's joints could approximate bell rhythms if manipulated just so. Hidden wind chimes hung beneath stages would catch the breeze at key moments, their tones matching the band's sequences. Some performers even trained crickets in cages to chirp in patterns that mirrored lunar hymns, their insect chorus rising and falling with the puppet's movements. Materials transformed into lunar archives. Marionettes' faces were often carved from applewood, a tree sacred to moon goddesses, and polished with night-blooming jasmine oil. Their strings, traditionally hemp, were replaced with silk spun under specific moon phases for initiates who believed this transferred celestial power. A surviving puppet in Catalonia still bears faint stains on its chest, traces of a paste made from moonwort fern, once rubbed onto ritual participants during full moons. Today, echoes of this lunar legacy linger. In Bavarian puppet theaters, certain marionettes still pivot to face north during performances, a holdover from moon tracking rites. And if you attend a midnight puppet show in rural Portugal, watch how the operator's shadow sometimes eclipses the stage lantern at precise intervals. It's no accident. After all, what's a moon worship ceremony without a carefully timed shadow crossing its face? The puppeteers knew when the real thing is forbidden, sometimes the most powerful act is to build your own. In the gilded cages of medieval courts where speaking truth to power could cost a head, jesters wielded puppets as philosophical weapons. Their stages were kingdoms in miniature, their wooden actors spouting nonsense that, if you listened closely, carried the weight of forbidden thought. The jester's forbidden riddle wasn't just entertainment, it was intellectual contraband, smuggled into the realm through the one medium no one thought to censor: laughter. Take the infamous dancing scholar puppet shows, where a robed marionette would spin in circles while spouting paradoxical rhymes. To nobles, it was slapstick, a clownish portrayal of absent-minded academics. But hidden in those dizzying turns was a coded critique of church doctrine. When the puppet declared, "I chase my tail to find the end, yet end and start on tail depend," it mirrored the heretical notion of a universe without beginning or end. The jester's exaggerated shrug, "who can say," wasn't just punchline, it was a landmine planted in the foundations of medieval cosmology. Even the puppet's construction held clues. Its detachable head, which rolled back to its feet no matter how far thrown, echoed the cyclical philosophies banned from universities. The genius of these performances lay in their plausible deniability. A jester could frame any dangerous idea as childish whimsy simply by having a puppet deliver it. When a wooden fool mistook a king's crown for a chamber pot, the court roared, but the underlying message about the fluidity of power lingered. Some jesters took this further, crafting riddles that changed meaning depending on the listener's knowledge. A famous example from Burgundy featured a two-faced puppet asking, "What binds the moon but slips through fingers?" Peasants might guess water. Initiates knew the answer was time, a reference to the banned concept of lunar calendars governing human fate. Materials became metaphors. Jesters commissioned puppets with reversible faces, one side grinning, the other grotesque, that could flip mid-riddle to represent duality. Others contained nested dolls, each smaller figure emerging to answer the riddle in increasingly subversive ways. A surviving jester's puppet in Vienna still bears traces of mercury in its hollow hands, allowing it to weigh objects unpredictably, a literal manifestation of relativistic thought. The church's own tools were turned against them. Biblical parables, when enacted by puppets, took on dangerous new meanings. Noah's Ark became a satire of clerical corruption when the animals miraculously swapped traits, a lion bleating like a sheep, a dove roaring. The real heresy wasn't in the puppets' antics, but in the questions they planted. If creatures could defy their God-given nature, why not humans? Why not kings? Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these riddles is how they shaped language itself. Modern phrases like pulling strings or being someone's puppet descend from jester wordplay about agency and control. And if you ever hear a puppeteer today pause just a beat too long after a seeming joke, listen closer. That silence isn't empty, it's the echo of 1,000 unanswerable questions, passed down through centuries of wooden mouths and laughing crowds. In the cramped textile workshops of medieval Flanders, where the clatter of looms echoed like muffled drumbeats, a revolution was being stitched into the very fabric of puppetry. The weaver's rebellion began as a series of secret gestures, subtle movements of fingers and shuttles that signaled everything from strike plans to hidden meeting places. When authorities cracked down on these silent codes, the weavers turned to the one place their motions could continue unchallenged, the flailing limbs of marionettes, where every exaggerated weave and knot became a manifesto in disguise. Picture a bustling market stage where two puppet weavers argue over a tangled thread. To most spectators, it's comedic chaos, figures yanking yarn in every direction. But to initiated textile workers, those jerky motions traced the exact patterns of the band hand signals. A puppet crossing its arms 3 times before throwing a shuttle mirrored the gesture for meet at third bell. The way a marionette's foot tapped the stage in alternating rhythms spelled out which mills were ripe for rebellion. Even the puppet's costumes carried covert instructions. Stripes woven in specific sequences indicated safe houses, while tassels tied at precise lengths revealed the number of days until the next walkout. The brilliance of these performances lay in their materials. Puppeteers, often former weavers themselves, crafted their stages from dismantled loom parts, repurposing the tools of oppression as instruments of dissent. The horizontal bars controlling marionettes were spaced exactly like warp threads, allowing weavers in the crowd to read the movements as they would their own machines. Some puppets had hollow bellies filled with tiny shuttles that rattled in protest rhythms when shaken. Others wore miniature versions of the red caps banned after an uprising in Ghent, their dye formulated from the same rebellious madder root. What made the Weavers' Rebellion puppets so potent was their duality. To authorities, they were harmless depictions of trade life, perhaps even cautionary tales about lazy artisans. But every mistake in the puppetry held meaning. A dropped spindle wasn't clumsiness, it signaled an impending work stoppage. A puppet, accidentally weaving its own fingers together, demonstrated the solidarity grip used during secret oaths. The shows often climaxed with the stage itself seeming to rebel. Backdrop curtains would part to reveal a woven tapestry depicting legendary strikes, visible just long enough for the workers to recognize it before the puppeteer panicked and closed them again. Timing transformed these performances into living calendars. Certain plays only occurred on feast days when textile guilds traditionally negotiated wages. The number of knots in a puppet's apron strings might correspond to the percentage of pay being demanded. Some troops used colored lights, red for defiance, blue for patience, casting the puppet's shadows onto nearby buildings where the entire workforce could see. The legacy of these rebellious puppets lingers in unexpected ways. Modern protest signs sometimes still feature the iconic tangled thread motif from those medieval shows. And if you examine traditional Belgian puppet theaters today, you'll notice something peculiar. The crossbars are always, without exception, exactly 90 centimeters apart, the same width as a 13th century weaver's loom. A final joke from the rebels, even the stages themselves were woven into the revolution, their measurements a silent salute to the hands that once turned thread into defiance. Deep in the forests of medieval Europe, where the boundary between human and beast blurred in the firelight, communities once donned animal masks to summon the strength of bears, the cunning of foxes, the sight of owls. These transformative rituals, where dancers became conduits for animal spirits, were outlawed as pagan devilry, but the masks themselves refused to disappear. Instead, they found new life on the puppet stage, where carved wooden faces became vessels for the very magic they were meant to suppress. The animal mask ritual puppets were masterclasses in sacred deception. At first glance, they resembled the comical beast characters common in morality, plays a fox puppet swindling a gullible farmer, or a bear marionette dancing clumsily. But the details betrayed their origins. The fox's mask wasn't fixed. It could slide aside to reveal a second, more feral snout beneath, mirroring the layered transformations of the original ceremonies. The bear's clumsy steps followed the exact stalking patterns once used in hunting rites. Even the materials whispered of older traditions. Some masks were lined with tufts of real fur from the animals they represented, while others bore tiny teeth marks along the edges, initiates way of feeding the spirit within. What made these puppet masks so radical was their interactivity. Unlike static ritual masks, the puppets' faces could shift expressions mid-performance. A rabbit's carved grin might split suddenly into a snarl, replicating the moment when a ceremonial dancer became the possessed beast. Some had hidden strings that let the puppeteer roll back lips to reveal carved fangs, or lower eyelids to expose glowing paint beneath, crude special effects that recreated the uncanny transformations feared by the church. The most elaborate examples even incorporated sound: hollow chambers in the mask's cheeks that moaned when tilted, mimicking animal cries once produced by ritual bull roarers. The performances thrived on misdirection. A typical show might begin with a hunter puppet chasing animal figures only for the tables to turn, the prey suddenly moving with unnatural coordination, surrounding the hunter in a circle. To most, it was slapstick, but those who remembered the old ways recognized the choreography, the same formation once used in initiation rites where novices were hunted by masked elders. Even the staging held clues. Puppeteers often performed near barns or hedgerows where real animal spirits were believed to dwell. Their makeshift theaters positioned so setting suns or rising moons backlit the masks at key moments, casting distorted shadows that recalled the original ceremony's monstrous silhouettes. Perhaps the most ingenious adaptation was the mask's construction. Traditional ritual masks were destroyed after use to release the spirits within, a practice impossible under church scrutiny. Puppeteers solved this by crafting masks with detachable parts, antlers that could be unscrewed and buried secretly, or beaks hinged to consume offerings of grain before snapping shut. Some had compartments holding tufts of fur or feathers that could be ritually burned after performances, maintaining the sacred cycle of invocation and release. A surviving wolf puppet in Bavaria still bears char marks inside its muzzle, evidence of clandestine fires set to free the spirit between shows. The legacy of these puppet masks lingers in modern theater. The exaggerated facial expressions of commedia dell'arte, the transforming masks of Japanese no drama, all carry echoes of that medieval ingenuity. And if you ever watch a puppet show where an animal character suddenly freezes, its mask tilting unnaturally toward the audience, you might be witnessing more than just a broken string. You could be seeing the last twitch of a forbidden rite when the mask stops being worn and starts wearing you. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was more than just workplace noise in medieval Europe. It was a sacred language, a coded symphony of strikes that shaped not just metal but fate itself. Blacksmiths, those alchemists of the mundane, had long performed the anvil dance, a precise sequence of hammer blows believed to transfer celestial power into weapons, to bend iron with more than just muscle. When the church banned these metallurgical rites as sorcery, the smiths didn't abandon their craft, they simply handed their hammers to puppets. Enter the anvil dance marionettes, wooden figures with exaggerated arms that swung in perfect, rhythmic arcs. At first glance, they seemed like simple slapstick, a puppet blacksmith comically missing his strikes, sending sparks flying. But to initiates, every botched swing was deliberate. The way the hammer tapped the anvil twice, paused, then struck 7 times in quick succession, mirrored the forbidden cadence used to temper legendary swords. The puppets' stilted gait as they chased hot metal across the stage replicated the circular pacing once performed around sacred forges. Even the anvils themselves were props with hidden meaning. Some had hollow bases that amplified specific frequencies when struck, recreating the harmonic vibrations central to the original ritual. What made these performances so ingenious was their use of fire and shadow. Puppeteers would position oil lamps so the marionette's elongated silhouettes on the back wall appeared to wield massive, mythic hammers, a visual echo of the godlike smiths described in banned text. Some shows incorporated real metal filings that burst into brief sparks when sprinkled over flames, creating the illusion of a miniature forge at work. The most daring troops traveled with anvils cast from the same alloys as ceremonial ones, their unique ring preserving acoustic patterns said to ward off evil. The symbolism ran deeper than mere mimicry. Original anvil dances often involved quenching blades in special liquids, an act too conspicuous to continue. Puppeteers solved this by having their smith figures temper props in barrels that sloshed mysteriously. Audience members seated close enough might catch a whiff of vinegar or wine substances once used in mystical metallurgy. Others noticed how certain puppets' arms would darken during performances, their wood stained by repeated contact with hidden iron oxide paste, mimicking the soot-streaked limbs of real smiths mid-ritual. Timing transformed these shows into covert ceremonies. Performances coincided with solstices, when traditional smithing magic was considered most potent. The number of hammer blows per act often matched the days between celestial events, a hidden almanac for those who knew to count. Some troops even adjusted their rhythms based on the audience. In mining towns, the strikes might echo local pit chants, while near monasteries, they'd adopt the cadence of forbidden forge hymns. The legacy of these puppet smiths lingers in unexpected ways. Modern blacksmith guilds still sometimes begin demonstrations with a stylized dance of hammer taps. And if you ever watch a puppet show where the wooden blacksmith seems to pause just before the final strike, as if listening to some silent rhythm, you're witnessing more than a comedic beat. You're seeing the ghost of a forbidden rite, still keeping time beneath the laughter. Music in medieval Europe was never just entertainment, it was power. Certain harmonies, certain intervals were believed to summon angels or demons, to heal the sick or curse the wicked. When the church banned a series of ancient musical rites for their unholy resonance, entire choirs fell silent overnight. But in that silence, an astonishing act of defiance took shape. Puppeteers rebuilt these forbidden songs note by note, not with sound, but with motion, transforming sacred melodies into a language of swaying limbs and trembling strings. The silent choir performances were feats of visual acoustics. Picture a stage lined with marionette choristers, their wooden mouths forever open in song. Though no voices rang out, every gesture carried the ghost of melody. A puppet's raised arm might climb in perfect sync with an ascending scale once sung in band rites. The synchronized sway of the choir mimicked the rhythmic pulse of drumbeats now forbidden. Even the puppet's construction held musical secrets, hollow bodies tuned to specific resonant frequencies, so that when their strings were plucked silently backstage, the vibrations thrummed through the audience's bones like remembered chants. What made these shows revolutionary was their use of absence as instrument. Just as monks illuminated manuscripts with gold, the puppeteers highlighted the missing music through meticulous choreography. A soloist marionette might hold a long note by freezing mid-tremble, its strings quivering to mark the sustained pitch. The sudden collapse of a basso profundo figure signaled a dramatic rest in the score. Some performances even incorporated conductor puppets whose batons traced the exact patterns once used to direct the band harmonies, patterns that, to trained eyes, reconstructed the sheet music itself in sweeping arcs through the air. Materials became musical archives. Choir puppets wore robes dyed with the same plant-based indigo used to tint hymnbook borders, its scent triggering memory. Their wooden hands were often jointed to form sacred mudra's finger positions that corresponded to specific notes in Byzantine notation. A surviving puppet in Toledo still has minuscule notches along its arms, musicologists now believe these marked where real choir boys once gripped each other's sleeves to maintain forbidden harmonic intervals during clandestine performances. The most daring element was the audience's involuntary participation. Without sound to guide them, spectators' minds would unconsciously reconstruct the missing melodies based on the puppet's motions, effectively singing the band songs internally. Some puppeteers enhanced this by distributing hymnals with the notes cut out, leaving only the lyrics. As the marionettes moved, viewers' eyes would dart to the gaps on the page, their brains filling in the excised staves with the very harmonies authorities sought to erase. Today, traces of this silent rebellion linger. In Austrian villages, certain puppet choirs still perform with their strings dyed different colors, a coded reference to the chromatic scales of suppressed Gregorian chants. And if you ever watch a marionette's hands flutter in seeming chaos, look closer. Those random tremors might just be tracing the trill of a 16th note, kept alive in wood long after human voices were silenced. The songs never truly died, they simply learned to vibrate through strings instead of throats. In an age when maps were guarded as fiercely as treasure chests, when knowing the wrong road could mean imprisonment or worse, cartographers faced a dangerous dilemma: how to preserve the forbidden geography of secret trade routes, smugglers' paths, and heretical pilgrimages without attracting the notice of kings or clergy. Their solution: to fold the world into the seams of puppet stages, turning innocent-seeming backdrops into coded atlases of the outlawed. The mapmaker's puppet wasn't just a performer, it was a compass in disguise. It staged a palimpsest of erased trails and whispered directions. Consider the wandering minstrel puppet shows, where a tattered traveler marionette would stumble across a painted countryside. To most, the backdrop was generic rolling hills, a winding river, perhaps a castle in the distance. But to initiates, every brushstroke held intent. That river's curve matched the hidden ford near Lyon where customs officers never patrolled, the castle's misplaced turrets. A cipher for the real stronghold's distance from the nearest smuggler's cave. Even the colors were keys. The specific shade of green used for forests indicated safe zones for fugitive priests, while brown trails that seemed to dead end actually pointed toward underground Hussite meeting places when viewed by candlelight at an angle. The puppeteer's genius lay in their manipulation of perspective. Many stages were built with forced depth illusions towers that appeared flat to authorities inspecting them head-on, but revealed hidden pathways when seen from the sides where the audience stood. Some used layered scrims painted with overlapping maps. As lanterns shifted, different routes glowed into visibility like phantom roads. The most elaborate shows employed rotating stages where each turn aligned painted mountain passes with actual compass directions, subtly teaching navigation through the puppet's movements. A marionette lost in a paper forest might pause at a tree shaped like an arrow, its trunk bent at the exact angle to point toward a real sanctuary village. Materials became covert legend. Backdrops were often painted on the reverse sides of confiscated maps, their original geography faintly visible under certain lights. Puppets representing merchants or shepherds wore costumes stitched with fabric from distant regions, a patch of Flemish wool here, a strip of Venetian silk there, clues to the origins of clandestine trade goods. Traveling troops in Hungary were known to craft their stages from aged barrel staves, the wood's grain deliberately aligned to mirror the branching paths of the underground salt routes. What made these performances so vital was their interactivity. Unlike static maps, puppet shows allowed for dynamic teaching. A drunken puppet staggering along a zigzag path might actually trace the switchback trail used to evade border patrols. A comedic chase scene could encode the technique for losing pursuers: 3 left turns around a painted mill pond, then a sudden crouch behind a cloth boulder. Some troupes even used magnetic puppets whose limbs swung to point north when placed near hidden lodestones in the stage, creating living compasses mid-performance. The church's eventual crackdown only deepened the symbolism. When authorities banned rotating stages, puppeteers responded with tumbling backdrops that flipped to reveal mirror image landscapes, the inversion itself a signal that the map was now coded. Others developed water-soluble paints, allowing entire geographies to vanish with a splash of rain during inspections, only to be repainted from memory at the next village. The most audacious troupes performed near actual landmarks, aligning their stages so that a puppet's outstretched hand would seem to point directly to a hidden mountain pass in the distance. Today, fragments of this secret cartography survive. In the Czech Republic, a restored puppet theater's backdrop still bears faint pencil marks under its paint coordinates for a silver miner's tunnel sealed centuries ago. And if you ever watch a marionette show where the scenery seems slightly off, where rivers flow the wrong way or towns sit on the wrong hill, look closer. That mistake might just be an invitation to follow the road less traveled, the one that doesn't appear on any sanctioned map. After all, the best way to hide a path isn't to erase it, but to weave it into a story no one thinks to question. Every puppet show must end, but in medieval Europe that final bow often concealed a beginning. The most subversive of all the banned ceremonies wasn't about preserving tradition or smuggling secrets. It was about mastering the ultimate heresy, a resurrection. When authorities outlawed rituals celebrating cyclical rebirth, puppeteers responded by staging performances where their wooden actors didn't merely take a curtain call, they died spectacularly, only to rise again moments later, turning the stage into a theater of forbidden renewal. The genius of these final bow performances lay in their dual nature. To the untrained eye, it was classic comedy, a puppet hanged, dismembered, or crushed, only to pop back up unscathed. But beneath the slapstick lay precise recreations of banned rites. A marionette hanged by its neck might dangle for exactly 33 seconds, the same interval once observed during spring equinox mock executions symbolizing the death of winter. The way its limbs jerked upon revival mirrored the convulsive dances performed in secret revival ceremonies. Even the materials whispered of resurrection, puppets carved from willow, the tree sacred to rebirth, or strung with cords woven from hemp harvested under a new moon, fibers believed to carry souls between worlds. Staging was everything. Unlike other puppet shows performed in daylight, these resurrection acts thrived at twilight, that liminal hour when the veil between life and death was thought to thin. Stages were often built near cemeteries or crossroads, sites traditionally associated with spiritual passage. The puppeteers' tricks leaned into this mystique. Dead puppets might vanish in puffs of smoke, burning sulfur hidden in their joints, only to reappear atop audience members' shoulders, a nod to the banned belief that resurrected souls sought new vessels. Some troupes used double-layered stages where puppets fell through trapdoors, their corpses replaced by identical figures rising elsewhere, creating the illusion of instantaneous rebirth. The most daring performances incorporated audience participation, always a risk when dealing with forbidden themes. A child might be invited to stab a puppet knight through the chest, only for the figure to dramatically reassemble itself, its wooden pieces snapping back together like magnets. This wasn't just spectacle, it mirrored the initiation rites of outlawed mystery cults, where novices symbolically died and were reborn. Some shows even distributed relics, tiny fragments of the dead puppets, that spectators were instructed to plant in their gardens, a direct reference to agricultural resurrection rituals. Materials transformed into theological statements. Resurrection puppets often had hollow torsos filled with seeds or bulbs, symbolic of life waiting underground. Their paint jobs told stories, a base coat of black pitch representing death, overlaid with vibrant hues that emerged as the puppet revived, mimicking the spring thaw's revelation of color. A surviving example in Strasbourg still bears traces of myrrh and aloe in its wooden limbs, substances once used to anoint the dead in pre-Christian traditions. The legacy of these performances is written in modern puppet theater's DNA. The classic Punch and Judy show, where the clown endlessly survives mortal blows, owes its endurance to those medieval resurrection rites. And if you ever watch a marionette collapse in a heap, only to rise moments later with a flourish, remember, you're witnessing more than a clever trick. You're seeing the last act of a forbidden ceremony, where death was never the end, just an opportunity for the show to begin again. From the shadows of censorship to the spotlight of survival, these 21 ceremonies reveal puppetry's greatest trick. It made oppression disappear not through force, but through ingenuity. When we watch a puppet show today, we see entertainment, but for medieval communities, these performances were lifelines, threading forbidden knowledge through the eye of a needle so fine that even the most watchful authorities missed the stitch. The midnight dance of shadows, the whispering marionettes, the fire puppets of Bohemia, each was a masterpiece of misdirection, turning censorship into creativity. Think about the sheer audacity it took to hide an entire healing ritual inside a puppet's hollow chest, or to encode astrological charts into the rotation of a wooden zodiac wheel. These performers weren't just artists, they were archivists preserving what power sought to erase, and they did it with materials as humble as applewood and hemp, proving that rebellion doesn't always need barricades. Sometimes all it needs is a well-carved joint and a cleverly knotted string. What's most remarkable isn't just that these rituals survived, but how they evolved. The same marionette that made a king laugh might later teach a band handshake under the guise of slapstick. A shadow play could mock the church while secretly tracing the steps of a pagan dance. Puppetry became a language of layered meaning, where every flick of the wrist or tilt of a wooden head could signal defiance to those who knew how to look. As we step back from this tapestry of hidden histories, ask yourself, where else might forbidden knowledge be hiding in plain sight today? In nursery rhymes, in carnival games, in the way a street performer's act just happens to mirror an ancient rite. The genius of these medieval puppeteers was their understanding that the best way to preserve something isn't to lock it away, but to let it dance openly where no one thinks to question it. If these stories have sparked your curiosity, imagine what other secrets might lie waiting in the footnotes of history. Have you ever encountered a tradition that felt like it held deeper meaning? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most fascinating discoveries begin with a simple conversation. And if you've enjoyed unraveling these threads with us, consider joining our community of fellow history enthusiasts. Together, we can keep pulling at strings, marveling at how much wonder and rebellion they still hold.